Chapter 4. The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The night of April 9th did not end with the shattering of the glass. It merely transitioned into a deeper, more suffocating kind of dread. The air in 422 remained thick, a physical weight that pressed against our skin, making every movement feel as though we were wading through water. Sam and I sat in the wreckage of our curiosity, the smell of St. Julian's wine filling the room like a fermented warning. We were trapped in a state of absolute paralysis, our minds racing to find an explanation for the violence we had just witnessed. The presence of Zop was no longer a name on a board. It was a shadow that had detached itself from the wall, standing somewhere just out of sight, watching us unravel. The terror became too much for Sam to bear. The girl who usually masked fear with laughter had been replaced by someone who looked physically ill. She could no longer tolerate the vibration of the house, that low-frequency hum that seemed to signal the presence of a predator. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and called her mother, begging to be picked up. I felt a cold spike of panic at the thought of her leaving. It was just my mom and me in that house, and with my mom at work, the thought of being the only living soul left in that environment was a psychological death sentence. I needed company. I needed a witness. When Sam's mother arrived, the atmosphere shifted from supernatural dread to human judgment. She was a devout Christian woman, and as we relayed the evening's events through stammers and gasps, the air between us grew cold in a different way. She didn't look at us with pity. She looked at us with a sense of profound betrayal. She couldn't fathom why we would ever allow ourselves to make such poor decisions. Why we would take the sacred safety of a home and invite something so ancient and hateful across the threshold. Even though the board was designed by my own hand and not bought from a store, she saw it for exactly what it was, an invitation to torture. Sam's fear was radiating off her in waves, a visible tremor that her mother could sense the moment she stepped onto the porch. There was no staying to talk it out, no comfort to be found in the adults. Sam's mother requested that she leave immediately, her eyes darting around the room as if she, too, could suddenly feel the demonic tension that was radiating from the walls. She wanted her daughter out of the splash zone of the mistake I had made. As the door clicked shut behind them, the silence that rushed back into the house was louder than the wine bottle breaking. I was left standing in the dining room, the red wine soaking into the floor like a fresh wound. I was freshly 17, alone, and suddenly aware that I had just signed a contract I didn't know how to cancel. The rules of the game were that you always said goodbye, but Zop hadn't waited for a farewell. It had announced its arrival with shattered glass and a basement door that refused to stay closed. I looked at the dark hallway, my heart sinking, as I realized that the people I loved most, the ones who were supposed to protect me, were about to become the skeptics in my own horror story. This was the beginning of the isolation. I was the one who had built the board. I was the one who had spoken the chant. In the eyes of everyone who wasn't in that room when the bottle flew, I was just a teenage boy with an overactive imagination and a taste for the dramatic. I was the boy who had cried wolf, but the wolf was already inside the house, and it was starting to get hungry. I had to face the night alone, knowing that every creak of the floorboards was no longer just the house settling. It was the sound of something practicing how to walk in my world. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a story about a child who lies until the truth no longer matters. But in 422, the roles were reversed. I had found the truth, a jagged, terrifying, and malevolent truth, but I was forced to play the part of the liar to keep the peace of the family home. I began to frantically clean the wine from the floor, scrubbing at the red stains until my hands were raw, trying to erase the evidence of the invasion. But as I worked, I could feel the eyes of something watching me from the hallway. It knew that even if I cleaned the glass, I could never clean the air. The fairy tale of my childhood was bleeding out on the linoleum, and I was the only one left to watch it die. The adrenaline was a frantic engine, fueling a pace I didn't know I possessed. With Sam's departure, the silence of the house had become an adversary, and the only way to keep the panic at bay was to move. I fell to my knees, scrubbing more at the dark red St. Julian's wine that had sprayed across the walls and soaked into the floor like an arterial spray. Thankfully, I had the right tools to handle the mess, but as the clock itched closer to the hour of my mother's return, a different kind of fear grazed over me. I knew I had to come clean about the destruction, but I had no way of forcing her to understand the impossible. I was hoping that by ripping off the Band-Aid and showing her the shattered remains of her wine, I could somehow bridge the gap to the even worse truth that lay beneath it. Strangely, as the physical mess vanished, the atmospheric pressure seemed to lift. The room settled into a deceptive quiet. I no longer felt the invisible eyes tracking my every heartbeat, and the restriction in my chest finally loosened. I was even able to close the basement door with a sudden, surprising ease, the hinges no longer groaning under an unseen weight. By the time I finished, the evidence of the violence was gone, save for the phantom scent of fermented grapes hanging in the air. I placed the larger shards of glass on the ottoman, a grim exhibit prepared for my mother's arrival, and sat back to wait. The April wind battered the siding of the house, a cold reminder of the world outside, while I sat inside, trying to decipher the logic of a nightmare. My eyes kept drifting to the hand-drawn board. I was convinced that the malevolence that had just terrified Sam and me was tethered directly to that piece of dresser wood, that the spirit and the object were one and the same. I believed that if I could just remove the anchor, the ship would sail away. Gaining a sudden, desperate surge of confidence, I stood up and seized the board along with the shot-glass planchette. I didn't wrap them up or hide them. I carried them out to the community dumpster with a sense of finality. I pitched them into the dark maw of the trash, right where they belonged, listening for the hollow thud as they hit the bottom. I felt like a man who had successfully disposed of a ticking bomb. I strutted back to the red door of 422 with my head held high, a massive sigh of relief escaping my lips. I walked back into the living room knowing, with a teenager's misguided certainty, that the evil was gone because the wood was gone. The house felt like mine again. I turned on the television, the flickering blue light acting as a shield against the memory of the evening, and watched the time tick by. I was ready for my mom to come home. I was ready to tell her about the ghost that broke her wine, confident that the worst of it was already sitting in a dumpster a block away. I had no idea that Zop didn't need a piece of wood to stay. I had invited it into the house, and it had already found a much better place to hide. The glow of the television screen provided a temporary sanctuary, the canned laughter of the show acting as a hollow shield against the silence of the house. I was desperately trying to lose myself in the fictional humor when a flash of light caught the corner of my eye, a reflection of headlights dancing across a framed picture on the wall. It was the signal I had been praying for. The mechanical hum of her car in the driveway felt like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning man. I rushed to the red door, greeting her with a relief so intense I had to mask it with a forced, artificial happiness, trying my best to project the image of a son who had spent a perfectly normal, quiet evening at home. The performance didn't last long. My mother followed her usual end-of-shift ritual, unpacking her belongings and sinking into the familiar embrace of her recliner chair. But as she settled in, the room's energy shifted. Her eyes narrowed, squinting through the dim light as they landed on the grim exhibit I had prepared. "Jonah, what is all of that?" she asked, her finger leveling at the jagged shards of glass resting on the ottoman. Before I could find the words, she followed up with the question I dreaded. "Where is Sam?" I told her simply that Sam had gone home early and likely wouldn't be back for a long time. The connection was immediate in her mind. That doesn't have to do with the glass, does it? "In a way, kind of," I stammered. "But not in any way that you would think." It took her only a few seconds to realize the shards belonged to her bottle of St. Julian's wine. In an instant, the exhaustion of her workday vanished, replaced by a sharp, rising heat. She didn't see a terrified teenager. She saw an underage son who had helped himself to her collection. The air in the room grew loud and jagged as she accused me of drinking the bottle, her voice filled with a mother's frustration. I tried to anchor her, to assure her that the case was far more dire than a stolen drink, but the truth was too heavy for the bridge of her logic to hold. I began to spill the truth, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. I told her I had made a very poor decision, that while Sam and I were hanging out, we had constructed a board and reached out to the other side. I explained that we had contacted something, a presence that took advantage of our vulnerability and stepped through like it owned the place. I spoke of the fear, the violent energy, and the way the bottle had been launched across the room by an unseen hand. But as I spoke, I watched her face harden. The Boy Who Cried Wolf wasn't just a title. It was the reality I was living. To her, this wasn't a paranormal confession. It was a desperate, elaborate lie to cover up a teenage binge. "I don't want to hear your stories," she snapped, her disappointment cutting deeper than any ghost could. "I haven't even been home 10 minutes, and I'm already fed up with you. Get out of my face." She stayed true to her own sense of reality, firmly convinced that I was a teenage drunk who had shared alcohol with his underage friend. The weight of her disbelief was a different kind of haunting. I was sent away, dismissed as a liar, and left to carry the burden of the night's trauma alone. The sanctuary I thought I had reclaimed by throwing away the board was now a prison, where I was both the inmate and the guard. I retreated, the silence of the house returning with a vengeance. Despite her anger, I clung to the one shred of confidence I had left. The board was in the dumpster. I believed the tether was broken, and that I only had to endure my mother's disappointment until the morning light proved me right. I didn't realize that by ignoring the story, my mother was unknowingly leaving the door open for the very thing she refused to believe in. I sat in the quiet, the smell of the wine still faintly present, wondering how I would survive a house where the living were as cold to me as the dead. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the heavy thud of my heart sounding like footsteps following me up each step. The room felt exposed, violated by the fact that it was now missing a top dresser door, the very wood I had used to carve a path for a predator. I sat on the edge of my bed, the springs creaking in the silence, and thought about the night's events with a sickening sense of dread. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I texted Sam to ask her how she was doing, desperate for a tether to the only other person who knew the truth. I got no response. The silence from her end was deafening. I felt like I had lost my best friend to this mistake, and now, with my mother's fury echoing from downstairs, I was drowning in a sea of isolation. The guilt began to loom over me like a physical presence, cold and suffocating. I had no idea what was to happen next. All I knew was that I had just witnessed paranormal activity in my own sacred space, and it had happened right in front of my face. The boundary between home and horror had been erased. I had no idea anymore if the entity had vanished with the board I threw in the dumpster, or if it was currently standing in the corner of the room, watching the rhythm of my panicked breathing. I couldn't even bring myself to put my feet on the floor. I felt like a child again, with a monster under the bed, paralyzed by the irrational certainty that if I let my ankles stray over the edge, something would grab me and pull me into a world where the light never reaches. Even the small amount of activity I had seen so far was enough to shake a person to their core, but the psychological weight was heavier. The one person who believed me, the one person who had seen the bottle of St. Julian's fly, wasn't allowed to talk to me. I was a prisoner of my own making, and I knew that from this moment on, nobody else would believe a word I said. I lay down and pulled my baby blanket tight against my chest. It was an emergency measure, a regression born of pure survival. I felt no shame or guilt in holding it. It was a gift from my grandpa right before he passed. It was my protector, a relic of a time when the world was safe, and I took advantage of every ounce of comfort it could still provide. As I lay there in the dark, my mind began to wander back to the childhood fears that used to haunt me within these same walls. I thought about the nights my mom would sleep upstairs and ask me to grab her a pop from the refrigerator. I remembered the frantic rush back up the stairs, my back tingling with the sensation of being followed. But my worst nightmare was a visitor I called Peeking Toe. Even now, as I write these words, the memory makes my skin crawl. Peeking Toe was like an average, everyday ghost, but it possessed a terrifying talent for torment. It always appeared under a sheet, floating and moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. But I could never see through the eye holes. Those eye holes were always crinkled, and in my child's mind, I believed it was because Peeking Toe had no face at all. Its energy was unidentifiable, a blank void wrapped in a shroud. I don't know what that thing was, but it was resilient. It had come to me in my sleep so many times throughout my life, and by God's grace, I never found out what was lurking beneath that sheet. I've never been more thankful for that ignorance, because even as an adult, I do not want to know what kind of emptiness requires a sheet to be seen. I lay in the dark, the memory of that childhood specter mixing with the fresh terror of Zop, until the frantic pace of my heartbeat finally exhausted me enough to drift into a shallow, uneasy rest. But the peace was a lie. As soon as I fell into sleep, I was plunged into a dream of absolute, crushing blackness. There were no visuals, only the high-pitched, vibrating sound of cicadas that seemed to echo inside my skull. I could feel the cold air brushing against my skin, smelling of damp earth and rot, as if I were standing deep in the middle of a forest at midnight. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the sounds of sticks breaking under a heavy weight. With every step, the snapping wood grew closer and louder, signaling something large and deliberate was closing the distance between us. The sound of the final snap happened right behind my ear, and I scared myself awake with a jolt. I woke up frantically, the kind of awakening where you feel as if you've been free-falling from a great height and hit the ground just before the impact kills you. I sat up quickly, gasping for air, my lungs burning, My eyes darted around the room, settling on the outlining of my walk-in closet door. A sliver of light was visible underneath. The closet light was on. My breath hitched. I knew I had turned every light off before I got into bed. I reached for the bottle of water next to my bed, taking a quick, desperate sip as I tried to regain enough composure to stand. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk toward the closet door. I reached out for the handle, my fingers inches from the cold metal, but I hesitated. In that split second of hesitation, I saw the sliver of light burn out. It didn't flicker. It didn't dim. Something behind that closed door turned the light off right in front of me, reacting to my reach. The realization that I was no longer alone in that room hit me like a physical blow. My heart sank to the bottom of my stomach, and the primal urge to flee took over. I turned and ran into the hallway, my feet barely touching the carpet. I didn't just walk down the stairs. I jumped, skipping steps in a frantic leap to reach the living room below. I landed in the living room, and a familiar smell brushed across my face, the scent of cherry cigar smoke. My mom was sitting in her recliner, the glowing ember of her cigar the only warm thing in the room as she watched TV. I burst into tears, the words coming out in a jagged, hysterical mess. "Mom, I had a horrible dream." I woke up gasping for air, and I looked at my closet. The light was on, and the entire room was black when I went to bed. I went to turn it off, and before I could even touch the door, the light went off by itself. I stood there, trembling, looking at her for any sign of the mother who used to protect me. Instead, she turned to me with a look of cold aggression. She told me to stop with my crap, and that if anything was actually happening, I had done it to myself. Her words were a second shattering of the wine bottle, sharp and meant to draw blood. She didn't want to hear about the closet. She didn't want to hear about the light. She had decided I was a liar, and she was going to stay true to that conviction, no matter how much I wept. I stood in the flickering blue light of the television, realizing that the barrier of trust between my mother and me was completely broken. I was stranded in a no-man's land. Behind me was a bedroom where something sat in a dark closet, waiting for me to return. In front of me was a mother who looked at me with disgust, seeing a teenage drunk instead of a terrified son. The isolation was now absolute. I had no protector, no witness, and no way out. I realized then that the board, being in the dumpster, meant nothing. The entity didn't need the wood to follow me. It had already found the cracks in my life, the broken trust, the isolation, and the fear, and it was moving into them. I looked back up toward the stairs, the darkness of the second floor looking like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I was 17 years old, and for the first time in my life I realized that some monsters don't stay under the bed or in the closet. Some monsters take over the very air you breathe, and they do it while the people you love most watch from their recliner, convinced that you are the one making it all up. I was alone with what I believed to be the devil, and the night was only halfway over. I stood at the base of the stairs, my eyes locked on the ascent. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping in my bedroom. I didn't even care about the comfort of my mattress or the privacy of my own space. My goal was the living room floor, anywhere near the physical presence of my mother. I dreaded those steps. Even though I reached out and flipped the hallway light on from the bottom step, the illumination did nothing to mask the terror. I felt it in my literal soul. I stood there, momentarily debating whether a pillow or a warm blanket was even worth the risk. If I had it my way, I would have slept in the car, preferring the cold vinyl of a seat to the predatory air of the second floor. I sat there, frozen, until my mom's voice cut through my paralysis. "What are you standing there for?" she asked, her tone sharp with lingering annoyance. I told her flatly that I didn't want to go upstairs. "Why?" she pressed. I reminded her once again. My story was not changing, nor would it ever. "There is something up there," I said. She simply brushed her hand at me, a silent, dismissive gesture that said whatever. I stood there for about 5 minutes, a cowardly sentry in my own hallway, before I finally bit the bullet. I formulated a frantic game plan. I knew exactly where the pillow was. I knew where the blanket sat, and I was going to dart in and out before the shadows could react. I was delirious, a novice to the mechanics of a haunting. It hadn't even been 12 hours, and I was already begging God for it to end. To drown out the silence, I began shouting numbers. 1, 2, 3. I counted all the way to 10 and back again, over and over. It was a rhythmic shield, a way to keep my mind grounded and focused on something other than the closet door. I have never grabbed anything so quickly in my life. As I sprinted back toward the stairs, I felt the unnatural chill of the fabric. My blankets and pillow were ice cold, far colder than the rest of the house. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't stay to try. I threw my bedding down on the living room floor and scrambled underneath, trying to get cozy while the TV roared in the background. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to itch myself away from the fear. In that moment, I realized that my terror was a scent, a psychic musk that ZOP was likely drooling over. I know it sounds stupid, but I lay there thinking about how unfair it was that this was the entity I had contacted. I finally forced my eyes closed, and the transition from sleep to wakefulness was as quick as the drop of a dime. The morning arrived, and with it, the brutal reality of my new existence. My morning routine was usually a sacred ritual of coffee and preparation, but that morning, I cut it into pieces. I refused to go into my closet. I wore the same clothes from the day before, unwashed and wrinkled. Did I get in the shower to clean myself? Absolutely not. I spent 0 time upstairs. I ran a comb through my hair and called it a day, fueled by a desperate need to leave the property. On the bus, I was a ghost of myself. Usually, I'd chat with my bus monitor and the driver, but that morning, they got nothing. I was too embarrassed, too terrified, and too exhausted. They picked me up at 5:40 a.m., and I made it my mission to sleep until we reached the school at 7:15 a.m. When I walked into the school, my immediate goal was to find Sam. I caught up with her in the cafeteria hallway, and she pulled me into a big hug, asking if I was okay. "Yes," I replied, my voice hushed. "But you didn't respond to any of my messages last night. Did your mom take your phone? Did she tell you to block me?" She shook her head, explaining that she was simply beside herself. She wanted to go home and forget that the night had ever happened. She had watched a movie, shut her phone off, and tried to delete the memory. I asked her if she wanted to hang out that night, but her answer was a knife to my gut. She was unsure if she could ever return to that environment until the house was cleared. "I don't know how to do that," I admitted. "We only knew how to invite. We don't know how to evict." The school day offered a strange, artificial peace. I finally felt human again, the texture of my skin losing its ice-cold chill and the scaly bumps of fear finally receding. I was in a safe place, surrounded by witnesses who anchored me to reality. Sam and I didn't speak of it in front of others. The weight was too much to bear. When the final bell rang and I went home, my plan was simple: sleep the entire night away. And for a moment, the universe complied. Nothing moved. No shadows flickered. No footsteps echoed. I stayed in the living room, refusing to go upstairs or down into the laundry room. It was a temporary truce. That ritual continued from April 10th through the 12th. I would come home and immediately descend into sleep, using the living room as my bunker. I manipulated the daylight, waiting until my mother was home and the sun was high to dart into my walk-in closet and grab the clothes I needed for the next day. I was living my life in frantic, timed bursts, always ensuring I had a human shield nearby. I was trying to outrun the darkness by staying unconscious, hiding in the blur of dreams where Zop couldn't reach me, or so I thought. But by the 12th, the cycle broke. I could no longer sleep. I had accumulated too much stagnant energy, and my brain was forced into a state of hypervigilance. I began feeling a deep sense of betrayal from my own body. It was forcing me to be awake, forcing me to deal with the reality of what lived in my house. The peace of the last 2 days had been a deceptive lull, a chance for the entity to settle in and wait for the lights to go out. I realized then that I couldn't sleep my way out of a haunting. My body was an open circuit, and the time for hiding was over. I was vulnerable, exhausted, and staring at the calendar, knowing that the 12th was going to be the day the silence finally broke for good, knowing my version of luck. I felt the air in the house begin to thicken again, that familiar, breathless restriction returning to my chest. My mind and body was betraying me, keeping me awake just in time to witness the next phase of the invasion. The evening of April 12th began with a deceptive sense of structure, a frantic race against the clock that I believed I was winning. My mother was due to leave for work in 20 minutes, a precious window of human presence that I intended to use to reclaim a shred of hygiene. I sprinted upstairs, my heart hammering a rhythm of survival as I reached into my closet. I spent no more than 5 minutes grabbing my clothes before retreating into the bathroom, the door locking behind me like the gate of a fortress. I turned the water on and reached for my phone, scrolling frantically for my Hillsong Young and Free album. I needed those Christian melodies to act as a spiritual disinfectant, hoping the high-energy praise would weird out whatever cold, ancient thing was lurking in the drywall. I spent 10 minutes in that shower, the steam rising around me like a veil, while the music blared to drown out the silence of the house. My pajamas were waiting on the counter, and my folded clothes for the next day sat at the very top of the stairs, a silent marker of my exit strategy. I moved through my routine with mechanical precision, drying off and glancing at the time. I was ahead of schedule. As I began to brush my teeth, I heard the sound that every child of a haunted house prays for: the unmistakable, heavy mechanical groans of a house being occupied by the living. I heard the basement door creak open downstairs, followed by the distinct, rhythmic thud creak of human weight pressing into the wooden stairs. I relaxed my shoulders, thinking, she's still here. I'm safe. I finished at the sink, grabbed my folded clothes from the top of the stairs, and descended with a triumphant smile. The bathroom light downstairs was glowing, and the basement door stood wide open, casting a rectangle of yellow light across the hallway. I felt a surge of success. For once, I had timed my life perfectly with hers. I walked toward the basement, fully expecting to find her fussing over the laundry. "Mom?" I called out, stepping onto the landing, but the washing machine was silent, its lid closed and cold. I moved further in, pushing through the hanging sheet that partitioned the room, thinking she was folding clothes in the back. The space was empty. The air was stagnant, smelling of old concrete and damp earth. Confused, I turned back toward the stairs. I figured she must have doubled back to her bedroom to grab something she'd forgotten. I marched up to her room and looked inside. Empty. The bed was made, the shadows long and undisturbed. My voice rose to a frantic, jagged pitch as I yelled at the top of my lungs. "Mom, where are you?" Absolute silence swallowed the sound. I sprinted to the kitchen, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I looked out the window and saw her car sitting in the driveway, motionless. But then, I noticed the small, terrifying absences. Her shoes were gone from the mat. Her keys were missing from the hook. I unlocked the front door and threw it open, searching the porch as if she might be standing there brushing her hair. There was no one. With trembling fingers, I called her. When she picked up, I heard the muffled chatter of another woman in the background. "Where are you?" I demanded, my voice sounding like a stranger's. "I'm at work, Jonah," she replied, her tone flat and exhausted. "No, you're not," I argued, the panic rising in my throat like bile. "Your car is in the driveway. You weren't supposed to leave yet." She let out a sigh, explaining that her car wouldn't start hours ago, so her sister, my Aunt Rose, had picked her up early. "Jonah, I left when you got in the shower," she said firmly. "I even said goodbye to you." My blood turned to ice. If she had been gone for nearly half an hour, then who, or what, had I just heard walking up those stairs? The chills that cascaded down my spine felt like needles. I hung up the phone, the silence of the house now feeling like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I tried to regain control, to investigate the logic of the situation. I walked to the downstairs bathroom and flicked the light off, then moved to the basement door to shut it. As the latch clicked into place, a sound drifted down from the top of the stairs, a faint, rhythmic whispering. It was a dry, papery sound, like dead leaves skittering across stone. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was unmistakable. It was a conversation being held in an empty house that I was alone in. The hallway light was off, and every door upstairs was shut, yet the whispering continued, ignoring my presence entirely. I stood at the foot of the steps, my body beginning to shake as if my very cells were depleting themselves of energy. "Hello?" I called out. The whispering stopped mid-syllable. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. I felt my throat begin to constrict, my lungs struggling to pull in a heavy, airless atmosphere. Then, the sound of a footstep, a heavy, deliberate thud, echoed from the landing above. My heart began to palpitate so violently I thought it would shatter my ribs. "I know something is up there," I yelled, my voice cracking. "I can hear you." In response, a rush of cold began to bleed from the stairway, very slowly stretching down the steps like a reaching hand. Then, without a finger touching a switch, the upstairs bathroom light, the one I knew had been turned off after my shower, flicked back on. The click of the plastic switch echoed through the hall like a bone breaking. My breath hitched, my soul begging for oxygen I couldn't find. I burst into tears, the terror finally breaking me. "Stop it! Now!" I screamed into the void. The light flicked off instantly, plunging the hall and stairway back into darkness. I took a deep, vocal breath, and with the last of my courage I shrieked, "Show yourself!" Zop did exactly what I told him to do. I stood at the foot of the stairs, paralyzed as the basement door handle began to turn. It didn't jiggle. It rotated with a slow, meticulously designed precision. The door began to creak open, an inch at a time, revealing nothing but the yawning blackness of the stairwell behind it. It was a planned, predatory movement meant to show me that my commands meant nothing to a thing that had already claimed the house. I was petrified. The reality of the basement door opening on its own was the final thread of my sanity snapping. I didn't wait to see the door finish opening. I turned and bolted out the red door, running until I reached my friend Kiera's house. I was visibly vibrating, my face a mask of tears and raw trauma. When she asked what was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to say the name ZOP. I couldn't tell her that my house was a mouth that was trying to swallow me. I lied, telling her I'd gotten into a fight with my mom, desperate to believe the lie myself, just so I could breathe. We walked around town for hours, but even the open air felt haunted. I was still in my pajamas, wandering the streets of Fenton with no regrets, because anything was better than the basement door at 422. When my mother finally came home, I didn't speak a word of it. The boy who cried wolf had learned that his cries only brought more anger, not protection. I retreated to my familiar spot on the living room floor, laying there like a corpse, petrified by the knowledge that I was sharing a floor with a door that could open itself. I watched the shadows of the television dance on the ceiling, wondering if the whispering had started again upstairs, or if it was now standing right behind her recliner. I fell into a shallow, haunted sleep and went to school the next morning, moving through the motions of a normal teenager while the scent of cherry cigar smoke and invisible shadows clung to my skin. I was trapped in a loop of fear, a survivor of a night that officially ended the peace. And here we are, April 13th. The date on the calendar feels like a countdown. I can still hear the click of that bathroom light and the slow, rhythmic turn of the basement handle. I know now that the house isn't just haunted. It's occupied by something that knows my name, and it's finally ready to show itself for what it truly is. By the fourth day of the haunting April 13th, I felt like a terminal patient watching the clock of my own life run down. I was a laughingstock in the eyes of the one person who should have protected me, and the isolation was becoming a physical weight that threatened to crush my spirit. I moved through the world like an actor in a horror film where the director's cut had been scrapped, and Zop had taken over the production. Every step I took felt scripted by something malevolent, a path leading away from the light of God and toward a darkness that was hunting me with predatory patience. I stayed isolated in my own mind, a prisoner of a secret that nobody wanted to hear, dreading the moment the school bus would drop me back at the doorstep of the house that had become my cage. Oddly, the entity never followed me to the hallways of my high school. I used to wonder why it didn't choose to torment me in public, why it didn't force me into a bad decision or a public breakdown. I realized then that Zope was a specialist in psychological siege. If I were sent away or locked in jail, he would lose his access to me. He needed me in the sanctuary of my home, where the walls could turn into ears and the doors into mouths. Even so, the reflection in the mirrors at school felt wrong. Every time I caught my own eyes in the glass, I felt like I was being sucked away, replaced by something that was hollow and watching. It seemed Zope hadn't been lying to the Ouija board. He was shy, a performer who preferred a private audience for his most violent acts. The bus ride home on that Friday was a blur of exhaustion. I fell asleep against the vibrating window, only to be woken by Dana, my bus monitor. She looked at me with a concern that made my throat tighten. "You seem down and depressed, Jonah," she said softly. "You've been super tired lately. Are you getting enough sleep at home?" I couldn't tell her about the whispered conversations or the slamming doors. I just shook her head and told her I was going through a lot. She told me she'd be thinking of me, and to have a good weekend. I told her and my driver, Susan, that I loved them, but as I stepped off the bus, the guilt of my silence felt like lead. If my own mother didn't believe me, why would anyone else? I walked into 422 and went through the motions, greeting my mom and getting something to eat while the air in the house began to thicken. Thankfully, her car was working again, and at 4:30 p.m. like always, she left for work, leaving me officially alone with the thing that lived invisibly in the house. I immediately dialed my grandma. I had already planned earlier in my day that I would do this for protection. I needed a witness. I needed a tether to the world of the living. When she answered, the sound of her sweet southern accent felt like a shield. "Mama, I need your help," I whispered. I explained everything: the board, the name, the wine, the lights. For the first time, the words didn't fall on deaf ears. She believed me. She told me I wasn't alone anymore, and all evening long, we sat on the phone together, watching Judge Judy over the line. The sound of the TV providing a background of normalcy and familiarity. But the normalcy was a short high. In the middle of our conversation, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, a dry, papery hiss coming from the top of the stairs. My grandma heard it through the receiver. "Do you have someone over at the house?" she asked, her voice sharpening with worry. I told her I was alone. "Well, who is that?" she pressed. I told her it was the thing upstairs. She asked me to go check it out, and I began the climb. I didn't even make it to the 4th step before the bathroom light flicked on. The switch moved by an invisible finger once again, my heart sinking in my chest all over again. "Mama," he turned on the bathroom light again, just like he did yesterday. I shrieked, scrambling back down the stairs as she let out a horrified gasp. "Oh my God, Jonah, does your mother know?" The activity was no longer waiting for the dark. It was emboldened by the fact that I had a witness on the line. I shifted my position to the living room floor, staring down the hallway, when I heard the unmistakable heavy creak of footsteps descending the stairs. I could hear the wood groan under a weight that wasn't there. I peeked my head around the corner, crawling on the floor like a desperate animal to get a better angle. But the hallway was empty. The air became ice cold, the hair on my arm standing straight up as a freezing draft swept through the room. My grandma was frantic now, threatening to call the police, but I told her there was no point. The police couldn't arrest a shadow, and the only person who would end up in a psych ward that night would be me. I retreated to the kitchen, sitting on the counter just to watch the cars go by on the street, craving more of human interaction. The surrealism of the moment was shattered when the downstairs bathroom door, the one right by the front door, slammed shut with a violent, bone-rattling thud. My grandma jumped on the other end of the line. "What was that?" she demanded. "It was the bathroom door," I told her, my voice flat with a terrifying realization. "It's angry because I walked away and I'm ignoring it." She wept over the phone, wishing she could come get me but paralyzed by her inability to drive in the dark. We said a prayer together, the words a desperate plea for a peace that felt miles away. When my mother finally came home, she found the two of us still on the phone, a cross-generational vigil of terror. She was immediately defensive, asking why Mama was still awake. My grandma didn't hold back. "Francine, I don't think he's lying," she said firmly. "I heard people talking earlier, and then I heard footsteps, and then that bathroom door slammed shut on him. Maybe y'all should come up here." But my mother's heart was hardened by her own plans and the exhaustion of her shift. She had a party planned for the next day, and refused to let stories get in the way of her life. She looked at me not with concern, but with the frustration of someone who felt they were being played. After I hung up with my grandma, the tension in the room was suffocating. "You're not even going to believe your own mother?" I asked, my voice cracking with betrayal. She argued that what my grandma heard was just the TV, or me slamming doors myself to get attention. She told me that I needed to stop worrying and get some rest, because we were going bowling with friends the next day. She spoke of bowling and parties, as if we weren't currently sharing a house with a demonic entity that had just slammed a door to express its rage. I realized then that my mother wasn't just skeptical. She was willfully blind, choosing a normal life over the terrifying truth sitting right in front of her. I went through the now familiar routine of grabbing my pillow and blanket to sleep on the floor. I lay there in the living room, the flickering light of the TV a poor substitute for the protection of a parent. I felt a deep, instinctive dread that this ritual of sleeping on the floor was going to be my life until something finally broke, either the house or me. It was now heading into April 14th, and the deceptive light activity of the week was beginning to boil over. I lay there on my back, watching the shadows, knowing that ZOP was just getting warmed up. The director's cut was over. The nightmare was now playing in real time, and I was the only one in the theater who couldn't leave. However, I didn't know it would finally affect my mother in the coming hours.